See, I've got a lot of problems with this bill, as I know you do too. Let's just focus on the curtailing of rights for individuals 18 to 21. Could you go into more detail of how this will actually impact those individual Second Amendment rights?
Well, it's going to, I think it's constitutionally problematic to treat people 18 to 21 differently for a fundamental right like the Second Amendment, to treat them differently than you would treat anybody else. There's no provision in the Constitution that allows that. It's going to be effectively a delay on their purchase that's different than others. And I wish this included a study on the impact of this by race and income level, because I'm worried that when you apply extra scrutiny to 18 to 21-year-olds, you're also going to get more false denials. And we've seen that with the NICS background check, that's already happening. And there's a disparate effect by race. And I think there are even some progressives in this body who are worried about that provision and the heightened scrutiny on 18 to 21-year-olds.
Yeah, I think there's already precedent out there from the Ninth Circuit, which is clearly not a circuit known for conservative opinions. Jones v. Bonta saying that it's actually unconstitutional to do this. Do you want to expand upon that?
No, I would just echo that. That is a recent decision, and I'm glad they came to that. Some people are saying it's because they luck of the draw. There was a random panel of judges, and they got lucky, and they upheld the Constitution that day. But as we've seen from the Supreme Court's recent ruling yesterday, I think when that decision that you just mentioned, that you can't deprive rights, this basic fundamental right that's enshrined in the Constitution, I think in light of yesterday's ruling at the Supreme Court and in light of the ruling in the Ninth Circuit that you mentioned, that what we have here in front of us today is an unconstitutional bill, at least that provision of it, that applies to 18 to 20-year-olds.
Thanks, Mr. Massie. And I want to focus on the engaged in business language, which, as you alluded to in your opening statement, is really a backdoor for universal background checks. Would you like to just talk about the practical implications of the engaged in business language?
You know, this is something that's always troubled me, the gray area and whether you need to have a federal firearms license or not. And I think there's something bipartisan we could do on this. Why do we want so much gray area here? And I worry, and I know people personally, before I came to Congress, who were prosecuted for selling firearms without a license and served time in prison, but they were selling from a personal collection. And that's, you know, and it's always debatable what's a personal collection, what's not. There's no numeric number on it. It's not, we don't define whether you need an FFL or not here in any way that's objective. It's all subjective, and they've made it even more subjective here, and I'm worried that by making the line less bright, by graying the line between who's selling from a personal collection and who's in the business of doing this as a vocation, we're going to end up with more people prosecuted who are just merely trying to transfer a firearm from a legal law-abiding citizen to another legal law-abiding citizen.
And you would agree that the push to do this would ultimately lead to a national gun registry, because even Eric Holder said you can't have universal background checks without a national registry. Would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, that is what this is. This is a backdoor universal background check, which is basically a registry. As we've seen at the ATF, they've collected hundreds of millions of gun records and put them in a searchable database, which is something they are specifically precluded from doing by federal law, yet we see that they're keeping this database. And what this provision will do is people will never know after this provision passes whether they can be prosecuted for transferring a firearm if they don't go to a dealer to do it. And so every time you go to a dealer, you create this paper trail, which, by the way, if it were useful, you know, in solving crime, there might be a reason to have it, but it's been proven, again, not to be useful. And this is going to cause, this is, I think, the precursor to creating a universal background check system for the purposes of a registry.
Thanks, Mr. Massie. My last line of question regards ex parte hearings. I'm one of the few people in Congress, I actually might be the only one in this chamber that's actually presided over an ex parte hearing when I was a magisterial district judge. I can tell you it is difficult when you're only hearing one side of the story. More often than not, I'd be willing to guess it was over 95% of the time the petitioner wins because it's his or her case that you're hearing no facts from the other side. I'm incredibly worried about this with the red flag hearings. Would you like to talk about how this could curtail somebody's due process rights?
Absolutely, and I'd like to add to what you're saying, something based on discussion I had with a senator last night. Again, we're trying to collect information about this bill. It's being rushed through, so I thought I'd talk to a senator. And this senator pointed out that if a judge goes through this red flag hearing and deems somebody unfit, in a snap judgment, it may be another judge who has to review that. And there's going to be an inherent bias in that second judge now, not to overturn the first judge, because the implications of making a mistake are so great that judge, his career would be ended. And so the inclination of the second judge, who's going to be reviewing the snap judgment of the first one, is to, uphold it. And so there's a low level of proof that's required in that snap judgment because it's supposed to be for only a few days. But that hearing biases the second judge. And I think that's going to create a big problem. And we've seen that in states. Like there's thousands of people who are on these lists now who can't buy a gun, who are obviously not a danger to themselves or others.
Thanks, Mr. Massie. We could talk about the states that actually do have red flag laws, in fact, that there's no differential in crime. In fact, there's some evidence that in those places, for example, New York, you actually have higher levels of crime. But we'll leave that to another day for the sake of time. So thank you. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Raskin.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. This bipartisan legislation is a small step in lifting the stranglehold of the NRA over the American legislative process with its warped and deformed interpretation of the Second Amendment, which is at odds with what the Supreme Court has said. There are hundreds of millions of dollars here for state crisis intervention orders, hundreds of millions of dollars for mental health services in schools. So this is legislation that I can support and I can get behind. It doesn't nearly address the problem in the comprehensive way that we need to address the problem the way that the vast majority of the American people are expecting us to do. Mr. Massie, it's good to see you. I just wanted to clarify something. Do you support or you oppose background checks?
The current system is so flawed, I'd have to oppose it.
Okay. So when you say we should enforce the laws that are there, I took that to mean that you think that we should be enforcing the background check laws against people who are trying to abuse it.
Anybody who breaks the law should be punished, yes, and I'm worried that they're not now.
Okay. But is it your reading of the Second Amendment that background check laws are unconstitutional?
My reading or the Supreme Court's reading, Heller,
Well,
this recent,
yeah.
let's just go by, rather than say what I would want for it to say, let's go by Supreme Court decision. And I think they've said, even just recently, as yesterday, even though I haven't made it all the way through this, that those sorts of things are allowable.
Yeah, okay, so we can uphold them. So, I mean, I hope you're saying, but you may not be, but I hope you're saying that you would support an efficient and accurate universal background check law.
Well, in fact, as you probably remember, a week or two ago, the majority moved a gun control bill through our committee, and I offered an amendment, which you all graciously accepted, and we passed on the floor, that would try to find out, would try to improve that system and look at what's happening with all of those denials and why they're being denied.
Okay. Well, Mr. Chairman, I'll just say, I think it's been decades since the Senate has been able to move anything. So this is a ray of light coming through. But when you look at the death toll in our big cities and small towns across the country, the urban areas and the rural areas and suburban areas, we're in a bloodbath of gun violence across the country. And what we saw in Buffalo, the convergence of gun violence with deranged, racist delusions, that is a huge threat to the people of the country. What we saw happen in Texas and Uvalde is a nightmare that is a call upon the moral conscience of everybody in the country to act. I just reject the idea that we can accept the sacrifice of children to a completely distorted and deformed concept of what the Second Amendment says. So this legislation begins to move us in the right direction. There's some positive parts about it, and I'm going to be supporting it. I'll go back.
Thank you. Ms. Fishbach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I would like to associate myself with the remarks of the ranking member and the other Republican members. I guess I'm just so disappointed that we're here at 7 a.m. in the morning. We are doing a great disservice to the American people by rushing this through. And the chairman even mentioned that that this isn't the majority's bill, and I've heard concerns about the bill. It is the majority's process, though, and we could be holding hearings, and we could be looking at these things, that both sides, these are important issues, and we could have those hearings if the majority allowed it. But instead, we're here at 7 a.m. while people are on this side of the country are getting their kids ready to take them to school. On the other end of the country, they're still in bed. And so we are pushing this through without any kind of proper procedure and allowing people to understand what's in this bill. And so that's just horribly disappointing to me because I think there are important issues on both sides that are being brought up. And so I will just, I just wanted to make sure that I made those comments because as a freshman, I think, you expect more. You expect more, and you expect to be able to understand what's in a bill before you have to vote on it, have public input, have the public understand what's in it so they can call your office. And so with that, I would just like to ask Mr. Massie if there's anything you would like to add before we finish.
No, I would just say, I got notice that I was going to be here late last night, around 10 or midnight. I was trying to talk to senators yesterday to find out if what we were going to be doing here, because we couldn't find out from our own majority leadership when this was going to pass and what was going to happen today. But I do regret that we're not following a procedure here or a process that the majority even voted for in their rules package at the beginning of this Congress, which was to give us 3 legislative days. And I'm actually particularly 72 hours. I will be rough on our own party. When we were in the majority, we had a 3-day rule, and which kind of got abused a little bit. Sometimes we'd introduce a bill at 11 p.m., and then you'd have 1 day, and then the next morning, so it would touch 3 days. And I think the Democrats made a wise choice and made it a 72-hour rule instead of a 3-day rule, so that there was no fudging it. But I'm at a loss to explain why we were here just a few hours later after this bill passes the Senate. It seems like we're not following that 72-hour rule that the Democrats put in place.
Well, and I appreciate that. It's just very disappointing, and I think a disservice to the American public that we are pushing this through like we are. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, let me before I yield to Ms. Gann, let me just say I'm sorry people are inconvenienced for being here early in the morning, but I think it's important.